So thank you so much for having me here today. I just want to tell you just a little bit more background of the story that Phil gave you, because you might be curious about how it came to be that the land where Chief Seattle lived was no longer part of the tribe's land. Chief Seattle lived in this longhouse for decades. He lived there with his family. It was one of the largest longhouses in the region, 600 to 900 feet long. It was a place where tribes gathered from all over the region to have potlatches and ceremonies. And after Chief Seattle died, the Indian agent asked the military to burn down the house. This wasn't just his house and his family's house. It was also the entire village had their location there. So this wiped that out. The story is that when Princess Angeline, Chief Seattle's daughter, heard about that in Seattle, she paddled her canoe back from Seattle across the sound. And by the time she got there, there was nothing but embers left on the sand, and she picked up the water with her hands, scooping up the water from Puget Sound and pouring it on the embers, just weeping. They're burning down Papa's house. They're burning down Papa's house. So then the longhouse was gone. There's actually a photograph. You can see a historic photograph of the people camping out on the land where the longhouse used to be. But they rebuilt their village in that place. And this time, instead of doing things in a way that made the Indian agent uncomfortable, which was to be living in one large longhouse, they built separate houses, their church, their school, graveyard. And then a few years later, the U.S. military came along and said, well, we need this land because we need to protect the Bremerton shipyards from possible attack. So they took the entire waterfront of the Suquamish Tribe. They didn't, by the way, touch any of the land on the Bainbridge side of Agate Passage, only on the Suquamish side. Took their entire waterfront, including where that village was. So the graveyard where you see now in Suquamish, a lot of those graves were moved from that village site. They had to move all their homes. And the military never did build any fortifications along there. At a certain point, they sold the land to a developer who portioned up the land into small plots for summer cabins for folks from Seattle to have a place to vacation. So the state parks had enough foresight to see that this was historically important land, and bought 3 of those lots, and that's what became Old Man House State Park. So I just wanted to fill you in on the beginning of that story, because it was exactly 100 years later. The land was taken from them in 1904. It was exactly 100 years later, in 2004, that the events that Phil read about took place, where that land was actually returned to them. But again, that was just 3 of the lots, and there's a lot of the rest of the land they still don't have back, although they now do have more than half of the reservation land back in tribal hands. Okay, that was not my original plan, but I just felt like that story is one that has just moved me greatly over the time that I've had the honor of living in Suquamish and living with the Suquamish people. So, coming back to today, we're in this interesting moment between the ending of one year and the beginning of another. We're just about at the New Year's Day. We've just had a Christmas holiday. It's one of those moments when I often pause to think for a little bit about what time it is. My friend, the late Grace Lee Boggs from Detroit, used to ask people who came to see her, what time is it in the clock of the world? What's going on right now, and what does it mean when we look at history in the larger scope? And my answer for today echoes this in-between time. I believe the old world is rapidly deteriorating. It's collapsing in some ways more rapidly and more bizarrely than I thought it would. And even as this old world unravels, the new world has not yet begun, which makes it a violent and terrifying time. On the other hand, maybe there are signs that this new world has begun, and it's just not being reported on. We're not telling each other the stories enough. especially as we remain transfixed by the chaos coming from Washington, D.C. And the patterns that are emerging are only starting to become evident. 20 years ago, we started Yes Magazine to tell the stories of these new patterns that are emerging. And now, just yet last year, we started PeoplesHub to actually teach each other the skills of bringing this new world into being. It could be stillborn, this new world, in the early days after the solstice. It feels as though the darkness won't let up, that we'll be forever in the gloom and the long nights. The signs of the new world are there, but can be hard to make out in the darkness and the fog of confusion and in our isolation. But Arundhati Roy said, another world is not only possible, she's on the way, and on a quiet day, if you listen very carefully, you can hear her breathe. In 2015, I spent 4 months on a road trip across the United States, looking and listening for signs of that new world being born. In particular, I was looking for signs of the emergence in 3 areas, which I believe are crucial to our hopes for the future: economic justice, climate justice, and racial justice. And I especially wanted to visit parts of the country I hadn't been to before: the Rust Belt, the areas around Appalachia, around the coal fields, the South, Native reservations, cities and towns and rural areas that are struggling, and that maybe because they're being rewarded less by the status quo, maybe they had answers that we aren't finding here on the coasts. And then I wrote a book about it called The Revolution Where You Live. So in order to get to those out-of-the-way places, I thought I should have the most flexible transportation I could think of, which turned out to be a pickup truck with a little camper. The reason I wanted something really small was both because I could afford it and because I wanted to be able to park in the middle of Chicago as well as out on a Indian reservation, out on the plains. I wanted something that I didn't have to make reservations. I didn't have to rely on being able to find somebody who could lend me a living room. I could park in a camping site or in someone's driveway, which I did. But I didn't want it to just look like, geez, that's a little dark to see. I didn't want it to just look like a boring white camper, so I asked one of my friends in Suquamish, Kate Avakana, who's a very talented artist, if she would be willing to paint it for me. And you can see for yourself what she did out in the parking lot. The front of it has a couple of canoes, which are, of course, the emblem of travel for the Suquamish people. And at the time, she was dating another artist by the name of Toma Villa, who's a very talented muralist. And so I came back to see how things were progressing, to find they'd gotten out the spray paint and the whole sides of the truck were in the process of being transformed. And they also used stencils made of cedar and ferns to actually create images of some of the iconic plants in this area as a reminder of home. So this is what it looked like as I took off across. Oh, you really can't see it very well, can you? Apologies for that. But you can go out and look in the parking lot and see yourself. You see what the truck looks like. This is what it looked like as we traveled, as I took off across the United States. I want to just tell you a few stories from my road trip and then tell you sort of where I came out as a result of it. The first one takes place very close to here, starting off in Bellingham, Washington. Many of you know that the Lummi tribe was very adamantly opposing a major new coal export terminal that was to be built in Bellingham, and they worked for years against it. This photograph is a representation of a check for the money they were offered to accept the coal plant, and it's stamped non-negotiable, and it's on fire in case the point missed anybody. So they were absolutely clear that even though they're an impoverished group of people, they were not going to accept money in order to allow this coal plant to go through. So I got curious, why would they suddenly need a brand new coal export plant when there's already coal export capacity in Canada? Where would all that coal be coming from? And it turns out it would have come from this quiet valley in southeast Montana called the Otter Creek Valley. And it would have been a giant strip mine, the largest in Montana. It would have excavated 1.2 billion tons of coal. in an open pit mine adjacent to the Custer National Forest and nearby the lands of the Northern Cheyenne Tribe. So I went there and spent some time with Elena Buffalo Spirit, whose family land is right on the Tongue River. Right across from that river would have been a railroad spur built to transport the coal to the main railroad line and then to Seattle and then up to Bellingham. And she told me about this land that her family has lived on for generations and where they still do ceremonies. I camped on her land for a while, and she told me that, she said, I'm a grandmother and I'm going to be a great-grandmother soon. And she said, what would I tell my grandkids if they said, Grandma, what did you do to stop this? What did you do to save our water and our land and our air? And she wanted to have an answer to that question, even though she was not at all confident that she could in fact stop this. It turns out that Jules Praying Wolf James from the Lummi tribe and others from the House of Tears carving studio had carved a totem pole and were bringing it out to the Northern Cheyenne tribe as a gift, and I happened to be there about when that ceremony was going to take place. So I stuck around long enough to be there and had a chance to interview some of the people who came to welcome the totem pole. And there were native people, there were also ranchers. This is a guy named Roger Sprague, and he said his family had been on the land since 1881. He told me, we respect that indigenous people have lived here for generations, and we want to protect this land. Just like my family history, we want to protect that too. And he said, this coal is to make big corporations a lot of money, and they'll do it on the backs of us small ranchers. So as I listened to the ranchers, and I listened to the prayers and the songs and the speeches by the native folks, I realized that they had a lot in common. They were all talking about this responsibility they felt, this gratitude they had from having inherited this land from previous generations who had taken such good care of it. And that they felt similarly like they had the responsibility to make sure that this sacred land and water was available to their children. And because of that, they were willing to do some really hard work. They were willing to do the tedious work of reading long environmental impact statements, of going to Helena to testify, going to Washington, D.C. to testify, month after month, year after year. It wasn't until I got home that I learned the news that they had in fact stopped the coal mine from going in. Arch Coal noted it as regulatory uncertainty, which means they basically delayed it long enough. The coal company was not at all convinced it was going to go in. So then I thought, well, that's an amazing victory for this small group of people, right, who worked so hard because they had so much at stake. And they get to keep their way of life intact, the native folks and the ranchers. Not particularly powerful groups of folks, right? They're an impoverished tribe and a few, but they did it. What a victory for them. And I thought, well, they're not the only ones that won. What about all of the people on that train line who aren't going to have to breathe all that coal dust? They won, including folks here in Seattle who won't be. And I thought, well, the Lummi tribe won as well. And in fact, they won their own case because the Army Corps of Engineers realized they could not overrun their treaty rights and refused to give a permit for that coal terminal to go in. And I thought, well, wait a minute, somebody must have lost here, right? What about all those people in Asia who would have been the recipients of that coal? But of course, it didn't take me more than a second to realize, oh no, they won too, because there's so many people getting so sick from all of that coal burning that's just polluting their cities. So they, in fact, won as well by 1.2 billion tons of coal not going up into the atmosphere. And I thought, hang on, I think we all won, because that's a huge contributor to climate change. And because of the work of this small group, that's that much carbon that's staying safely in the ground. And that just made me think about how powerful people can be when they take a stand where they live. And how even some of the big issues that we think of as only being possible to deal with on a national or international basis, we can actually have power over where we live. So that's one of the stories about the climate crisis and how we can move on that. Another one is on economics. We often, again, think of economics as this big abstract thing that only the experts know anything about. When I was in Louisville, Kentucky, I had an opportunity to talk to a man named Nelson Escobar, who's immigrant from El Salvador. And when he first moved to Louisville, he wanted to eat the same foods he'd been eating, so he decided to grow them himself. He came from a farming family. But he was growing 23 different crops and realized it would be a lot more fun to share the work. So he ended up organizing a collective of folks who are all interested in growing food. Each of them grows 3 different crops, and then they share the harvest at the end of the year. I was lucky enough to be there for the Harvest Festival. There was a band playing on the front porch. There were kids playing soccer. The community was gathered to eat some of the lovely food that they had grown together. This little team is working on aquaponics, on growing fish as well as vegetables in greenhouses. And if they can figure out how to do that, they're going to spread the word to local schools and nonprofits. And, I thought about, they only had 10 acres of land. 10 acres, by the way, that they were loaned by a woman who realized that the fact that she owned that much land, 10 acres not being a lot, but still more than a recent refugee had, she realized that was a function of the privilege she had of growing up as a white person and the wealth that came along with that, and she decided to just share it. So I thought, this, as an economic proposition, this would not be considered a good idea, because you could much more easily get a plow and a tractor, and one person could easily farm 10 acres. This is so inefficient. But of course, they're doing something very different. They're actually producing something that is really scarce in our society today, which is a sense of community, which is the love that they have for one another. It's a project that means something more than any one of them could accomplish alone. So they're producing food, yes, but they're producing something else that is especially in scarcity right now. The last story I'll tell you is from Ithaca, New York. And as I said, mostly I stayed off the coast, but I did go to Ithaca. And Ithaca, as you may know, is a very progressive community. It's got Cornell, it's got Ithaca College, lots of good things going on there. And of course, like many other communities that consider themselves progressive, they would not think of themselves as having a race problem. And of course, like all communities in the United States, they do. This story is, I had a chance to talk to these folks who run an organization called the Civic Ensemble. And what they do is they hold story circles where they ask people questions about their community, and then they turn the responses they get into theatrical productions and bring them back to the community. So one of the story circles was about, ask people the question, when have you felt safe or unsafe in public spaces? And one of the stories they got was from a woman who had a middle school-aged son, and this young man missed his bus and decided rather than bother his mom, he was going to walk to school. But it was much further than he anticipated, and he ended up walking for a long way, including through an affluent white neighborhood where someone called the police on him. So we've heard many stories of this kind. In this case, the story turned out okay. A police officer showed up and found out what was going on and called the young man's mother and got permission to take him to school, and he went to school and it was fine. But she was rattled by the understanding that her son simply walking through this neighborhood was enough to provoke a phone call to police. And she was also rattled because not that much before that, there'd been another incident in which some young black men had been pulled over by an off-duty police officer out of uniform who had pointed a gun at them. And these young guys were totally terrified and confused because they didn't know that was a police officer and didn't know why someone was pointing a gun at them. And again, things could have gone terribly wrong, as we know from the news reports. It would have been so easy for one or both of those young men to end up dead. So the community realized that this was an issue. And so for the purposes of this play, the Civic Ensemble took that story of the young man and the trip to school, and they switched it around. Instead of simply going to school, the young man and the police officer started having a conversation. How did we get to this point? How did we get to this point where we are so divided, where the violence and the oppression that has been part of the experience of African Americans since the slave trade continues in all these different forms, whether from Jim Crow or from the legacy of lynching or from today's mass incarceration and police shootings. How did we end up in this continuous pattern of oppression, and what will we do about it? So they created this theatrical performance about this, and then at the end of the performance, which they're showing there in Ithaca, they turn on the lights and they have a conversation with the people in the audience. And that enables this community to say, no, this isn't just something that happens in the South. This is something that happened right here. And it's interesting, the character that plays the woman who called the police, she considers herself a good progressive. She says, I read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, I'm a good guy. And this gives people a chance to have that deeper conversation and say, what are we going to do differently right here in Ithaca? So once again, this is a poster from the production. Once again, racism is something we often talk about in progressive circles. We say we need a national conversation. We do, but we also need local conversations, because racism and white supremacy take place in every single location in the United States. And to go deep enough to change that means changing the institutions and changing the culture of every place that we live today. So, those are three of my stories. I'd love to tell you more, but I don't want to take up too much of your time, so let me just skip ahead to, I came back to Suquamish. I sat in my little cabin for a few months and wrote this book, The Revolution Where You Live. And as I thought about it, what I'd learned, I kept coming back to these different stories where people in their communities had done really powerful things. They had taken on the climate crisis. They reinvented in small ways what they meant by an economy that works for all. They'd taken on racism. Those were the three things I went looking for, and there are so many others in which that has happened as well. And that work we often think again in progressive circles that what we're doing is we're fighting against the bad stuff. But these communities in each case were not just pushing back against the bad stuff, they were creating the kind of world that we want to live in. So what's different now, 2 years later, during this dark season of increasing chaos? What new signs are we seeing of a new emergence? And I think one of the important signs is the rise of indigenous leadership, like we saw at Standing Rock and elsewhere. It's not only becoming more powerful, but it's also teaching any who will listen that there are different ways of thinking about the world. There are other worldviews to embrace. Young people are rising from Parkland to counter gun violence and from all over to fight against climate change. And they're bringing in a connection across difference that we need so badly, and acknowledging that the spirit with which we work is also foundational to the sort of world we want to build. The women's marches were amazing. With all the disaster of the Trump administration, for many, it was when they woke up and realized we can't outsource our activism. Signing a petition and writing a check isn't enough. We have to make the revolution at home, and we have to be the leaders. Together in communities, we have the power. In communities, we can choose to not only fight oppression, but to create the world we want. And that means experimenting, learning together, and sharing innovations that work for everyone. And it means building power. It maybe sounds overwhelming to take on all this brokenness ourselves. But here's the thing. While we're working together as a community, we're also learning to nourish and sustain each other. The energy we get from community, the personal growth, the inclusiveness, the resilience in hard times, the friendships, those can nourish us and keep us coming back to make things better still. PeoplesHub, the organization that came out of what I learned on the road, is a place where people are bringing what they know about this sort of place-based change, and they're taking what they need. It's an emerging hub of learning and growing, and I encourage you to join us. Take a workshop or offer a workshop, or sign up for our core trainings to develop your vision and liberating processes and shared leadership. This emerging beloved community is grounded in our communities, offers both the light we so badly need and the fuel for the revolution. A new, more just world doesn't happen sometime in the future. It's something we create and can fight for and live in every day, beginning by working together now where we live. Thank you.